I think for everybody, in order to be successful, there are 5 steps that you go through essentially. That everybody has their goals. What is their goal and the passion? So you have goals. And then what happens is you're going after your goals and you encounter your problems. Okay, so encountering problems. And then the big difference between people is how they approach those problems. People who get bummed out by the problems don't learn from them. Who learns from them? So those who recognize that problems are exciting, that they get into those problems or mistakes. Mistakes are learning experience. The pain that comes from that mistake. Every time you have pain, it's an indication that something's at odds. And so the people who have the pain are the people then who will go into that, realize that if they solve that pain, solve that problem, understand what that is representative of, not just the one problem, but that problem is a certain type of problem that will happen over and over and over again in your life. And if you can solve, how do I deal with that kind of problem? And so diagnose. The third thing that everybody needs to do is if they have problems on the way to their goals, that they diagnose those problems and they get to the root cause, the real root cause. The real root cause is typically what people are like. Can you go to what you're like? Can you go to your mistakes? Can you go to your weaknesses? Right? Can you go to other people's mistakes and weaknesses? Some people, because of an ego barrier, can't do that. And so if they don't recognize their own mistakes, their own weaknesses, or others' mistakes and weaknesses, what the root cause being what they're like because of ego barriers, if they can't go there, they're going to repeat those mistakes. They're going to have them over and over again. So it's the process essentially of saying at that stage, what am I like? Everybody has strengths and everybody has weaknesses. The weaknesses are the other side of the strengths. So let's say if you're a right-brained, creative person, you may not be reliable because just the way you think necessitates you to think a certain way. That means you can't think in another way. That means you're going to keep bumping into that thing that's standing in your way. But unless you can embrace, I'm not reliable, right, and deal with it, you won't get around it. It's still going to continue to be a barrier, right? So the diagnosis to the root cause is important. So then, if you diagnose it, then you have to design what are you going to do about it that works. So let's say you are very creative but not reliable. Okay, you have to find a means of, first of all, embracing that, and then saying, if I'm not reliable, what do I do? Do I work with a reliable person? Do I learn reliability? Do I have some compensating mechanism? Because I can't let that lack of reliability stand in the way of my goal. As long as I keep doing that, I'm going to keep running into problems. So you have to design what you do about the problems. And then when you're designing what you do about the problems, then you have to follow it through. So you have to follow through or do the thing you designed. And the doing the thing you designed requires self-discipline and so on. So people have to do those things in order to be successful, right? They have to know what their goals are. They will encounter their problems. They have to diagnose those problems down to the root cause, the real root cause. They have to design ways to get around them. And then they have to have the self-discipline to follow that. And it's a continuous iterative process. So that's what we keep doing, right? So you're going in that direction. I would say that all of the shapers are doing that. They're doing that well, right? So they don't mind the problems. They don't mind that. That's their adventures. Wonderful book is Einstein's Mistakes, right? And you hear his struggles, right? He wouldn't have been able to be cutting edge. He wouldn't have been able to be inventive if he didn't go through that. So when you're looking at the personality characteristics lend themselves to doing that 5-step process well. It's the mixture of the elements that matter, right? If you have a tremendous tenacity, but you're studying, you're learning, you're trying to memorize and remember everything that you're being taught and you're really trying hard. You could have great tenacity. You need the making sense of something. You need to embrace reality. You need these other dimensions, right? So I think the things that we started to talk about just before, the things that these people have a need for is first they need to most fundamentally make sense of things, which is a very different kind of learning process. It's a very internalized learning process. It's not a memory-based process. So none of these people, unlike the population as a whole, none of these people have a desire to follow instructions. For most people, you go to school, they tell you what class to go to, what classes to take. This goes all the way through university. They do this, do this, and then you go into the class and they say, learn this, and this is the information. And it's largely a memory-based, instructional-based process. This is not what these people do, right? This is not. So the path, what they have is a strong desire to understand and make sense of reality. How does reality work? Okay, and then so they're all very independent, thinking, and rebellious. Okay, they don't mind, saying screw you. This is what makes sense, and I've got to go down that path. Right? They're comfortable with ambiguity. They love ambiguity. Some people don't like ambiguity. Most people, they say, oh, I'm nervous about ambiguity. They love to go in the space of what's ambiguous because that's where the discovery is, right? They love making mistakes, the process. They understand that making mistakes, loosen up. It's like, going to ski or something. You can't learn how to ski unless you're falling. So they don't mind the falling. They're not embarrassed about making mistakes. They're not worried also about the approval of others, right? So many people are constantly saying, oh, well, risk, the whole different definition of risk. What's risky? They're not worried about what people think of them, right? Is that risk or failure? The term of failure is a totally different thing. The failure is a part of the learning process, right? What's the risk of failure? What, you'll be embarrassed or risk of failure? How do you distinguish failure from learning? In your whole life, failure implies that it stopped, that the game stops, right? If it's part of you're failing and then you learn, then that learning is part of the moving forward, right? So that is what the process is like. Fail, learn, move forward, and constantly do that because you're cutting edge. You're going where people haven't been before in inventiveness. That's exciting to those people. So that's a different kind of approach to life, right? It's a different way of being. People are so attached to being right. And yet the tragedy is it could be so easily to find out how you're wrong. If you just said to yourself, I'm not sure that I'm right, and let me go find people who have alternative point of views, and let me have quality conversations, not to pay attention even to their conclusions, but to their thought process. So thoughtful discussion, worrying about being wrong, but not to the sense of being paralyzed or moving forward, but in the sense of trying to create discovery, to have an exchange, to go after the person who has the most different point of view, who is the most thoughtful, and then have a conversation to see their point of view, whether a person could be both open-minded and assertive at the same time. That creates a discovery process. It creates a fabulous learning. And that process itself reduces the probability of being wrong and produces a great deal of learning. People are so hung up on being right, starting their discussion and deriving some sort of satisfaction if at the end of the discussion they were where they began the discussion. So that doesn't make any sense because there's not going to be any learning. So ego plays an important role in that, right? That's the people who feel like I'm good, I've got it, won't learn. If you've got it, you won't learn, right? So you have to get rid of this ego barrier, I've got it thing. Then the issue of weaknesses. Like every human being has weaknesses. And it, as I say, it's the opposite side of thinking. In other words, if you have a brain that works one way and you're doing certain things that allow you to do things that way that you're excelling, it means that your brain is working in a manner that has its pluses that'll cause its minuses. So the creative person who's not reliable, or the reliable person who's not creative. But if they don't embrace that, they're going to continue to encounter that. Ego barrier is the worst thing. And if we were raised differently, just imagine in the schools that all along that people will always say, everybody makes mistakes. Everybody has weaknesses. The key is really to understand what your mistakes and weaknesses are so that you can learn from them, right? I think punishment is a terrible concept. Punishment means that you made a mistake and you're being punished. I think instead of punishment, every time somebody makes a mistake, you should say the only thing that you need to do to get out of your punishment is first think, what kind of mistake was that? So if I'm in a situation that's like that again, how would I deal with it differently not to make that mistake? So that learning should come from the mistake, not punishment, because you're teaching people not to make mistakes. Where's where the learning comes from, not the appreciation that if you keep doing this over and over again, you're going to keep encountering the same outcomes. In my particular case, I started trading markets when I was a kid, when I was 12. And the markets, there are certain things about being in the markets in terms of decision making that are unique, that encourage this kind of thinking. So first, because all of the consensus is already baked into the price, in order to be correct in the markets, in order to make money in the markets, you have to see something that the consensus doesn't see. So you have to have an independent point of view. Very different than most other professions. Most other professions, you can build on existing knowledge. You don't have to have a point of view. If you're a doctor and somebody breaks a leg or whatever, you can repair that leg. It's not zero sum in the sense that you have to be smarter than the next person or different from the consensus. Now, in order to be different from the consensus, there's a high risk you're going to be wrong. So if I form that point of view and I'm wrong, the probability of being wrong I'm trying to reduce. And so by having other people stress test my thinking, it's very practical, right? So I say I work really hard to have this independent point of view, and then I bring that independent point of view out there and I say, shoot at it. How am I going to be wrong? And let's have that quality back and forth. And so that was just a practical approach. Find people who have alternative points of view and have quality conversations back and forth. Not to let them think for me, not for me to follow their point of view, but for me to understand the different perspectives, right? Very, very practical, because it increases my probability of being right and it reduces my probability of being wrong. And what I discovered in that process is that I was learning so much. So just imagine what a path it is, fantastic path, to think, let me go after the person who has got the opposite point of view, who's really smart, and let me have quality conversations, quality disagreement. So in my case, it was very much motivated by that. And then I have clear measures of whether I'm right or wrong. So there's a clear accountability. In other words, I could do whatever I want. It's my responsibility. If I made a purchase or a sale, I can measure on a day-to-day basis how good that process is. So I get clear feedback. Just the goal is, don't be too wrong, be more right than wrong. And so in that process, it's not I can take personal accountability. I mean, if I don't learn personal accountability, then I'm going to pay a terrible price. So that process itself lent itself to this kind of very open-minded decision the making mistakes and the loving the mistakes. And then because I believe of that, we have a culture that's of radical transparency, right? So every meeting is taped and made available for everybody in the company to look at. And all we have are conversations of what makes sense. Like everybody has the right to make sense of things. Okay, now in that environment, I get to see how differently people think. I realize how radically different people think. And so that was a curiosity to me. Because it's masked. You have no idea what's going on behind other people's eyeballs. They're in their heads. They all look a lot alike, but their brains work so differently. So that led me to brain science. In other words, so I was very, very interested in understanding literally how the brain works and the physiology of the brain. And and we have different physiologies. So what we think is just our interpretations are things like love. Love is physiological. There's a chemical in your brain, I forgot the name, it begins with an O, that is where love comes from. So this physiology, our brains are structured differently. And then when you start to realize that the brain is very much like the body. In other words, there are parts of that, your body, you can exercise and change certain parts of that. You have a certain body, and maybe you can get more muscular to a certain degree, and maybe you can't. And then there are parts of your brain, parts of your body that you can't change. You can't change your bone structure, right? That's just the reality of the brains, and that is what people are like. So the recognition of that, the embracing of that reality is great, yet we don't talk about that. And that's a tragedy. Reality is reality. Okay, which is going to produce more discomfort? Denying reality? I call harsh truths. There are harsh truths. Things you wish were not the case. Okay, but they're truths. Do you want to know about them or do you not want to know about them? It's practical to know about them, right? If you want to make success, it's practical to know about all those harsh realities, right? Know about the harsh, and then deal with the harsh realities. The person who doesn't want to go there is not going to know the harsh realities, and they're not going to make progress. The person who loves to know what reality is, whatever it is going to know how to deal with reality in the best possible way, right? So what's the fear? Well, you're learning. You can reject, right? In other words, forget their opinion. The opinion doesn't matter, right? You will bring all information together and then form your own opinion. But let me see that perspective. What is it brings in from knowledgeable people, from thoughtful people, those things, and then you can assess that. Does that make sense? And also test yours. In other words, you ask them the question, but gee, it doesn't seem that way. So have that dialogue. They should do it open-mindedly. If you can say, can we really have an open-minded dialogue so that you can consider what I'm saying and I can consider what you're saying. So what we're in a path to try to find out what's true. That's or even the presumptions, the cause-effect relationships, right? Because everything works like a machine. Every outcome has causes. So when you think of it as let's state what our machine is. How does the world work? How does reality work? And have a conversation. How does reality work? And if we can agree it works this way, then you can say, okay, now let's put in the circumstances, and that will mean that these things will happen. If that's the cause-effect relationship. If you can work through conversations and you say, actually, reality works that way. So that's what the conversation can provide.